Well, hello. Welcome to Building Chords. Chords make up the foundation of harmony, so not gonna lie, they're kind of a big deal. So let's jump right in. If we're going to start to understand harmony, we have to know a few basic terms. First of all, chords themselves. Chords are combinations of three notes. They're played within a scale or in a given key signature, and they're played at the same time. Play them separately, it's called an arpeggio. We're talking about all of them at once. Harmony is the relationship between these chords in a given key. In other words, how do these chords function? How do they relate to each other as they move from one chord to another? To get us going, we're going to have to take scales and we're going to have to number all of the notes in the scale. So here's an example. A major. There you see every note, and there you see every note numbered. These are called scale numbers or scale degrees. And you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then you have 8/1. Eventually, we're going to be using numbers to name the chords. And there is no 8 chord. And that's because if you look, A is A. So we'll just use 1 from now on. So we have 7 different chords that we will be able to make. And the A's are just going to repeat each other. So chords. Chords start as a single note of the scale. They are built by stacking 2 extra notes on top of that first note, which we call the root note. The notes that we add are added in intervals of a third. So back up. We might need to know what an interval is. An interval is a space between the notes, or the distance from one note to another. And it's always going to be some sort of number. So as you're determining the interval, make sure you account for each note. For example, the interval from A to B is a second. A, B. 2 notes, the interval is a second. For chords, we need to know intervals of a third. So naturally, an interval of a third is going to have 3 notes. For example, A, B, C sharp, 1, 2, 3. So A up to C sharp is a third. So let's make a chord based on the note A. It's the first note of the scale in this case, so it makes a lot of sense. You start on A, that's 1. You count up to 3, A, B, C sharp. So there's half your chord already. You have the first note, the root note, A. A third above it is C sharp. But we know that chords have 2 sets of thirds. So the way we find the next third is we start where we left off, which was C sharp, and we go up another third. So C sharp, D, E. There are your 3 notes. There you have your scale. There you have your chord of the scale. You have an A, a C sharp, and an E. Just a quick review. Said it before, I'll say it again probably. The A is the root of the note. We built this chord based on that, and then we built 2 thirds on top of it. A to C sharp up to E. But if you check it out in relationship to the A to C sharp is a third, but going A up to the E is a fifth. And all chords are going to have this, a root note, a third, and a fifth. So all chords built on thirds, and they can be and they are built on each note of the scale. There's our scale. Now they're all going to be root notes. All of them are still numbered. We have the scale degrees, and you can add a third on top of them, and then a further third on top of that one. So you see 2 sets of thirds. If you relate everything to the root note, we have a root, a third, and then a fifth. All just a matter of counting. The chords can be named based on the note used to start the chord. So in other words, the root note. A chord built on an A is called an A chord. A chord built on B is called a B chord. So on and so forth. However, when we start talking about harmony, the chords are going to be renamed according to the number of that root note. So that's why we actually put all those scale degrees in. So if you're starting to build a chord on the first note of a scale, that chord will now be a 1 chord. If you're going to build a chord on the second note of a scale, that will be a 2nd chord, and so on and so forth. Not rocket science. Just try and keep it as easy as possible. The only thing that looks a little different is that we are using Roman numerals to name these chords instead of the Arabic numerals. But this actually works out to our advantage because, as you see, there are uppercase and lowercase Roman numerals. So this will help us determine major and minor because as you naturally build these chords in a major or a minor key, you get major and minor chords. And actually, if you check out that seventh chord, there's a little degree symbol. That's something a little special. We'll get to that at a later time. The other thing to remember about chords is that chords are still chords, no matter how you spell them. Even if the root note is not on the bottom of the chord, it's still going to be named after the root note. So here you see that A, C sharp, E, that's the A chord. Now, if you take the A and you move it to the top of that chord, C sharp's on the bottom, E's in the middle, A's on top, that's still an A chord. We still have the three notes that we need to make an A, it's just in a different order. You could then take that C sharp and move it to the top, and now you have E, A, C sharp. It's still an A chord. We still have the three notes that we need. So even though it's spelled differently, they're going to sound different, but they're still an A chord. The difference in that spelling is called being in inversion. Just like if you invert something, you're turning it upside down or changing perspective. That's what we are doing here. We can have first inversion, which is when we took the first note, the root note, and moved it to the top. And we have second inversion where we take the bottom two notes and move them to the top. So again, nothing fancy. We moved it once, first inversion. We moved it a second time, second inversion. So now we know about individual chords. What chords are common in the scale? Because there are 7 different types of chords. Obviously, some of them are going to be more important. And the two most important are called tonic and dominant, 1 and 5. The tonic chord, or the 1 chord, is the chord based on the first note of the scale. That makes it the most important. We call it an A major scale. A starts, and the chord is going to be an A chord. It's the most important thing. Your piece of music is going to start on the 1 chord. Your piece of music is going to end on the 1 chord. The audience is going to hear that and acclimate themselves to it very quickly. Think of it like your home base, the most important thing. The 5 chord, or the dominant chord, is the second most important because that is the chord that takes us home. After you play a 5 chord, the ear naturally wants to hear the 1 come after it. And it's because of 2 things. First of all, going from 5, the 5th note of the scale, to 1, the first note of the scale, is a very stable relationship. 5-1, sol to do. And over hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years, the human ear has trained itself. This is a good sound. We like it. It's a strong relationship. It's very good. Oddly enough, the most unstable relationship also is within this chord, and that is going from the 7th scale degree back home. If you remember your solfege from choir or maybe elementary school, we know do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. And if you don't finish it, people go nuts. You need that ti, do to feel that you have completed the scale. And that concept, 7 to 1, ti, do, is right there in that dominant chord. In this example, we've been talking A major. So the 7th note of the scale is G sharp. There you see the G sharp. It has the 7-1. It has the 5-1. So the dominant, very important. There are the other chords. Obviously, there are some that are more important than others, and we can talk about 2 more really quickly. The first is a 4 chord, which is called the subdominant, built on the 4th note of the scale. And the other chord that's very popular is the 6 chord, based on the 6th note of the scale, and it's called the submedian. Now, there is a reason why it's called tonic and dominant, subdominant and submedian, but we're not going to discuss that today. We don't need to know them to hear it and to know why these chords are important. Just know that they are. You can see the uppercase and lowercase qualities. So the submedian, or the 6th chord, is going to be minor, while the tonic, dominant, and subdominant, 1, 5, and 4, are going to be major. Now, if we use these 4 chords, 1, 4, 5, and 6, they basically make up the vast majority of music. And again, it just, after years of experimenting, these relationships between 4-1, 5-1, and 6-1 are very stable, and it just feels good. It sounds right. And in fact, if you listen to the radio, at least 3/4 of what you hear on the radio those songs are going to incorporate these chords. It could be maybe in a different order, but they're going to be there. And this comes from the blues, making it into rock and roll, making it into R&B and hip hop. and it's just always going to be there on the radio. Very, very popular chords to use. And in fact, there's been recent studies that the music in the 2000s is actually getting more simple. So you might find songs with fewer than 4 chords, 3 or 2, and there are some rap songs that actually just use 1 chord the entire time. Now, I'm sure I could go on and on about the validity musically of using just 1 chord, or maybe I could ask you if it's interesting to listen to someone with a monotonous voice just drone on and on and on, but that will be a different time. Let's get back to these chords. If we use these 4 chords, you can rearrange them a number of different ways. But what you see in front of you, 1, 6, 4, 5, 1, is extremely popular. It's been used since, well, probably forever. Blues use it, 60s music, 50s music, all of the cute things that your parents and grandparents listen to are going to be built on this. And you probably recognize this chord progression when you hear it. And you might have heard something on the radio and you said, hey, this reminds me of another song. And you can sing the melody of one song over the chord progression of another song. Well, if you can do that, that's because they share the same chord progression. And my guess is that it's this one. So we've been talking A major. Let's change it up a little bit. Let's talk C major. If we were going to identify these chords in C major, what would they be? So this is sort of attacking the problem backwards now. Remember, in C major, a C is the first note of the scale. So a C chord would be the 1 chord. So there's a big hint. So really what you're doing is counting. The 6th note of the scale will be your 6th chord. The 4th note will be the 4 chord. The 5th note will be the 5th chord. And you get C, A, F, G, C. You see major and minor in there with the uppercase Roman numerals, the uppercase letters. You see minor with the lowercase Roman numeral and the lowercase letter. So this diversity in tonality, major and minor, is a good thing. A great song to demonstrate this, and especially these 4 chords in these progressions, is a song called Hallelujah. It was made famous in the movie Shrek, although it was written by Leonard Cohen many years before Shrek came out. And if you know the words, probably many of you do, and you know the 4th line, it goes like this: the 4th, the 5th, the minor fall, the major lift. Suddenly, this sounds way more interesting in the context of our discussion. How cool is that? Leonard Cohen is being incredibly clever with his lyrical choices because he's describing to the listener, to you, the chords he's actually using to play the song. And it works. Well, it only works because he doesn't have to say F major, G major, A minor. He can just say 4, 5, and then, artistic license, minor fall, major lift. And that's important. It's important to know all of the chords with their Roman numeral number, not just their note name, because composers can then utilize that same chord progression in different ways, in different key signatures. And it's good for performers too, because maybe you have a singer who can't sing so high or so low, or maybe you're playing on like a tin whistle or an ocarina that can't play in a whole bunch of different keys. You have the ability to know a chord progression and insert that chord progression into a new key, like this. There was a secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord, but you don't really care for music, do you? It goes like this: the 4th, the 5th, the minor fall. A secret chord David played and it pleased the Lord, but you don't really care for music, do ya? It goes like this: the 4th, the 5th, the minor knowing the chord progression is very, very versatile, very important. So, key points. What can we take away from today? Bunch of things. First, intervals. Intervals are the distance between the notes, and we have a bunch of them. There are seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, sevenths. We've mostly focused on thirds today, but all these other intervals are important. To make a chord, we're using two sets of thirds, two sets of those intervals, and you build them right on top of each other, and you build them on the root note. With that root note, if you go in relationship, two sets of thirds, you get a third above the root and a fifth above the root, and all chords are going to be made this way. Chord names can be named after the note you're using as the root. So if you build a chord on a D, it's a D chord. If you build a chord on a C, it'll be a C chord. But when you talk about harmony, or how the chords function within the key as they relate to each other, the chord is given a different name based on the scale degree. So whatever number the note is in that particular scale. So in D major, a D note is the first note of the scale. A D chord is a 1 chord. In D major, a G note is the fourth note of a scale. So a G chord is a 4 chord. Just lining up numbers and letters. And the only thing that's slightly different is that we use Roman numerals for these chord names. Uppercase or capital Roman numerals for major, and lowercase for minor. So after all this, who cares? Why do we need to know this? Well, knowing about chords and how they work is really important for any single performer, because most performers are playing in an ensemble, and at any given time there's almost always a chord being played. And knowing about chords and knowing which notes are the most important helps you to balance that chord. So the root and the third will tell us if a chord is major or minor. So if you're playing a root or a third, you can bring that note out. If you're playing the fifth of the chord, you can lay back a little bit. You don't need to blast. You need to hear a good balanced sound. Also, knowing how the chords work, like we talked about that T-do in the dominant chord, can help you phrase the melody. It can help to add dynamics. And even if you're not playing the melody, you're playing the harmony parts. If you can hear that your harmony is creating tension by creating that 5-1 or that 7-1 sound, you can bring that out and really sort of affect your audience. And on top of everything else, if you play a 5 chord and go to 1, it feels like you're going home. So if you're playing a new piece of music and you hear 5-1, that gives you a good idea that you might be at the end of the phrase. Or as a listener, if you're hearing a brand new piece of music and you hear it go 5-1, 5-1, 5-1, you might know you're at the end of the piece. For example, Beethoven does this all of the time. His Fifth Symphony actually has over 50 chord progressions at the end that are just 5-1, 5-1, really driving that point home. So it can be very effective. Compositionally, knowing a chord progression is very, very good. You can have a chord progression and say, "Ooh, this sounds good," and then knowing those chords, you can pluck out the melody for that. Or you can attack it the other way. You could have a melody, and because you know what notes are in the melody, you can build chords around that as the harmony. And this actually has a lot of uses. Let's say you have a D in the melody. This is kind of neat because you can use a D major chord, or you can use a D minor chord to harmonize that. You could also have a G major chord or a G minor chord, because Ds are also in those chords. Ds also show up in B minor and B flat major, so you can really change the mood of a piece of music or even a simple melody just by changing the chords that are being used. It's a very effective way to sort of sneak up on people. 1, 4, 5, 1, 1, 4, 5, 6. You can surprise your audience and create really, really neat effects. So by knowing all these different things, it really helps us to appreciate and to understand and to perform this music better. So as we all try and find harmony in our lives with social life and professional life and everything else we do, we can take solace in knowing that there's always going to be some sort of harmony that we can see and hear and affect in music. Happy playing.